And good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Two Guys and a Bible. I am flying solo this evening. Don messaged me this afternoon and said that he's having a sore throat, lost his voice, he said. So he's not able to join us tonight. Well, coincidentally, I have a sinus infection. And if you go to my sermon on Sunday, boy, that was rough. I could barely even talk. Kind of sounded like I do now, but now I've got a lot more coughing, and stuffiness and things like that. So you're going to get a short Two Guys in a Bible this evening because we didn't have a backup plan for this evening. And so I'll do what I can. And then maybe we can rejoin you next week. We have what's called the Sand Mountain crud here in North Alabama. On Sand Mountain, the pollen just hits so hard. And you can take Zyrtex and whatever for months and months and months, and nothing will prepare you for for what you have to endure up here sometimes. So I actually ended up going home after our Bible study this morning at church and the fellowship hall. I went home and laid in bed for a while and just was puny and pitiful. But I've worked up the energy. I ate a couple tacos, so now let's have a Bible study together this evening, ever so briefly. We're not going to go an hour, but I hope you'll appreciate what we're going to be talking about tonight. Therefore, if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there is any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, Philippians chapter 2 and verse 1, going into verse 2 now, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Let's pause here just for a second. You'll notice this little part. I don't know, I'm pointing. I could just be drawing on my screen. This part, make my joy complete. This is an interesting expression. Apparently it shows up in John 3:29. It shows up several times in 1st and 2nd John. 1 John chapter 1, fullness of joy, shows up a couple times in John's gospel account as well. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe it shows up in Psalm 22. See if I remembered that correctly. Perhaps I did not. But I thought that there was a passage here in Psalm 22 that mentioned fullness of joy. I didn't think about bringing it up to this point until just now, so you'll have to forgive me for this one. For some reason, I thought that there was something in Psalm 22 about fullness of joy. Perhaps not. I'm still convinced there is, so I'm looking for it. But that's okay. Yeah, I don't see anything. Could be skipping over it. Regardless, though, this idea of fullness of joy or making joy complete has with it the idea, just making somebody happy, right? Like John rejoiced to see his children walking in truth, as 2nd John says. But there's also an eschatological context to this expression. Again, you look at John chapter 3 and verse 29. Switching versions on me again. John chapter 3 and verse 29, you'll see the connection here between the arrival of the bridegroom and the joy being made full. And notice the long list of passages here. John 15:11. Excuse me. I've said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. 16:24. Ask and you'll receive so that your joy may be complete. 17:13. So that my joy may be complete. Philippians 2:2 is where we are now. 1 John 1:4. 2 John 12. Joy may be complete. There is this idea of obviously somebody being happy, but there's also this eschatological idea of seeing all those things come to fulfillment. And so Paul, in Philippians chapter 2, who is writing in light of them standing strong until the end, he's praying for strength to come so that they may receive deliverance instead of destruction in Philippians chapter 1. He's looking to the point. Yeah, Larry, start there and just find it. No. There's an idea somewhere there, and I will find it. But it's probably going to be after I get off the broadcast. Let me tell you something I did. I just can't help myself. Larry, So I dropped my kid off at daycare yesterday, and they have on their board Bible review, Bible story review, colors review, story time, circle time, playing outside, uh, review numbers 1, 2, and 3. My preacher brain looked at that board, and for 24 hours, I thought to myself, oh, that's cool. They're in numbers now. Because sometimes it'll say Bible story review Joseph or Bible story review, Joshua or something like that, or David and Goliath. But it said Bible story, or it said a Bible story review. Then up underneath it, review numbers 1, 2, and 3. And I thought, these 3-year-olds are studying the Pentateuch. And it wasn't until the day when I went back in there and it hit me that they were learning to count to 3. So to recognize the numbers, 1, 2, and 3, not just count, but to like actually be able to write them out, and that made my day. But that just shows you how scattered my brain is right now. All right. I wasn't even planning on stopping at that verse 2. I was trying to get to something else. So let's go to verse 3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind. Regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interest of others. So this idea here of humility, love, kindness, tolerance towards each other. Same ideas come up in, my brain just broke again. Ephesians chapter 4. John says, bro, the first 7 books of the Bible are PG-13. Yeah, maybe more than that. Talking about banning books in schools, And I'm like, man, have these people read their Old Testaments? Oh boy, there's some stuff in there I wouldn't want little kids reading, tent pegs through the skulls and that kind of thing. Some of that's a little PG-13, like you say. But anyways, my preacher brain, though, Numbers 1, 2, and 3. And Numbers 1, 2, and 3, the genealogies and the marching formation and all that, it's not really toddler, it's not really a story that you tell your kids before bedtime. Let me tell you the order that they lined up to march through the wilderness. It's just not something you think about. But my brain was turned off. So, I thought my kids went to like a really cool daycare, which they do. But that part made me a little bit too excited until it hit me what was actually going on. Okay. Philippians 2:5. Now we're getting to the point. CGR, you say you have a question. Feel free to ask. If I'm able to answer, I will. But this is a short episode, man. I'm not feeling too hot. I'm just going to try to move through this and come back next week. All right. I just felt bad about not putting anything out, so I wanted to give you something. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Understand there's translation difficulties there in verse 6, but this is not really the verse we're focusing on anyways. But he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. We're going to focus on this verse 7. Just a couple of thoughts, though, from verse 5 and 6. First, our attitude towards each other should reflect Christ's attitude towards us and Christ's attitude in general. If you look at Jesus' life and holistic disciple, go ahead and drop your question too, and I'll be glad to look at it. Hang on just a second. Christ's attitude, his direction, is continually downward. Have you noticed that? He comes down in the incarnation to take on flesh. He goes down into the waters of baptism. He goes down into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He goes down this path of conflict and tension with the religious leaders. He goes down into death by being raised up on the cross, but still down into death, down into the grave. And then God is constantly following behind Jesus, lifting him up at every step of the way. He brings wise men by way of a star to the site of his birth to give gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. He speaks this blessing upon Jesus when Jesus comes out of the water. This is my beloved son. He's with him every step of the way through the works that he gave Jesus to do. He is with him on the cross. God was in the world, or rather in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? But the answer to that At the very end of the chapter is he has not despised the one that's been afflicted, right? And then you have the resurrection, of course, 3 days later, and then the ascension, right? And so Jesus's direction is always downward. He's always pouring himself out. And that's the idea here in verse 7, this word of, this idea of kenosis or kenosin. So, excuse me, this idea of kenosis, kenosin, kanao, different people, different people say this word differently, or refer to this concept differently, but it's just this idea of emptying oneself, of pouring oneself out. Laying aside privileges is the center column, what the center column would say in the New American Standard 95 version. But I just want to point out what this means for us. In Hebrews 5, the Hebrews writer says that the high priest, earthly high priest, was draped with weakness so that he could react with gentleness to those who were ignorant and to those who were wondering. In like manner, Jesus took on flesh. He is a co-sufferer with us in our afflictions, Hebrews chapter 4 says. And so this idea of emptying himself is just remarkable, We sing songs about him leaving the splendor of heaven and whatnot, and taking on flesh and taking on the form of a servant, as Philippians 2:7 says. And the question is, for us, if we really believe that Jesus has done that, this radical emptying of himself, a process of atonement, process of reconciliation, in other words, they didn't begin at the cross, but began at the incarnation, or maybe even perhaps began before the world began. If we really buy into that, especially as preterists, then should that not lead us into an even more radical way of having this attitude in ourselves, which is also in Christ Jesus, laying down our what privilege we might have, to use kind of this language from verse 6, to lay down the prestige, to give up the game of who comes first and who comes last, but do what Jesus did in the parable of the vineyard in Matthew chapter 20, and point out that everybody gets the same wage at the end of the day. Should this attitude then of humility should it not be magnified in those of us who fully have embraced this message of kenosis and the fullness of joy that we now have because of these prophecies being fulfilled? That's just been on my mind here this week. Perhaps it's been on my mind because that's the passage and the lectionary coming up for Sunday. I like to consult it from time to time. Usually there's some pretty neat connections there, but I thought you'd appreciate that idea. This isn't some kind of stunning eschatological revelation or something, but I think it's important for practical application of the message we believe as preterists. A few other thoughts here. Notice him taking on the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men. Notice a contrast here between Jesus and the first Adam. Adam made in God's image. Jesus, God, taking on man's image for the purpose, the appearance as a man, for the purpose of becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And all this because he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped or a thing to be held on to. You almost have an opposite picture of Adam reaching out and grabbing the fruit, trying to be like God as if he already wasn't made in God's image. And then Jesus doing the opposite, taking on flesh. It's just a beautiful picture. All right, let me look at some of your questions here, and then I will go ahead and hop off. As you can tell, my voice is hardly keeping up with this, with the coughing and whatnot. Got a lot of questions. All right, CGR, a challenge. How do we offer a full preterist interpretation of Micah 4 and not have the futurists mock and scoff and cry ridiculous? Well, that'd be a good question for somebody who had Micah 4 memorized. Okay, we have the reiteration of Isaiah chapter 2. Excuse me. I need to know which particular passage you have in mind. Maybe that could be something that Don and I could talk about next week, because again, I'm just not feeling it all too well right now. Do you just mean this part about peace and whatnot in Micah 4:3, or which part do you mean in particular? All right. Okay, let me look at something else. Holistic discipleship. Okay, CGR says, I believe the earlier books of the Bible were put together in Ezra's time, that is, time of Babylonian captivity. Yeah, I don't have a problem with that, I suppose. I think most people, I don't know if most people, but I think a lot of people recognize that portions, at least portions, of even the Pentateuch were put together later than what we might think. I mean, think about this happened when we were on the other side of the Jordan. I mean, at least the introductions, right? So I don't really have a issue with that point. Okay, holistic discipleship. Does preterism provide us any insights in relation to Romans 9 regarding election and vessels prepared for destruction? Can you please expound in Romans 9 and how it relates to full preterism? You really were itching to ask that question, weren't you? Oh, boy. I think, all right, quick breakdown of Romans 9. I think reading Romans 9 as from an individualistic perspective is totally off. Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Where is that at? There we go. Verse 13. This is a quotation, of Malachi chapter 1. This is not talking about individuals. It's talking about Edom, if you look at it. Malachi chapter 1. It's not talking about Esau's personal election. Such a thing isn't in Paul's mind. He has in mind the election of nations. In this particular case, Jacob, Israel, was loved. Esau, Edom, was hated. That is, it would be through Jacob whom the seed would come, and not through Esau, right? So I think maintaining the consistent corporate reading of the resurrection passages in Romans 8 and the resurrection passages in 1 Corinthians 15, maintaining that same reading in Romans 9 through 11 is vital to understanding the passage. It's talking about corporate election and not individualistic election. It probably is cutting out. It probably is cutting out. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Let me see. Just reading your comments real quick. Make sure there's nothing else there. Maybe you missed all that, which would be unfortunate. What I said, holistic discipleship, though, was that I think we have to maintain the corporate reading through Romans 9. You read the corporate element is brought up in Romans 5, Adam versus in Christ. Romans 6, we're all baptized into one body. Romans 8, you have again the body imagery there. We're all being led by the Spirit. Romans 9, even he talks about that, to whom belong the adoption as sons, the glory of the covenants, etc., etc. Those that were foreknown were Israel, Romans 11. And so I think when you read passages like Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, you're not thinking individually. God loved Jacob the person and hated Esau the person, instead corporately. This is a quotation of Malachi. My idea here is that it is Israel is the one through whom the promises would come. Edom, however, would not be the one through whom the promises would come. The descendants of Jacob versus the descendants of Esau. Not them as individuals, but them as corporate entities, so to speak. Okay. Park asks, I'm not trying to say your first name, if it's John or Hun, I'm not really sure. How does a preterist understand when Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise? There are various explanations of this. Some would say that the thief went directly to heaven upon death. They would pull from 2 Corinthians 12. Paul was caught up into the third heaven, caught up into paradise. Pull from Revelation 2. The tree of life is in the midst of the paradise of God. And they would say, of course, the thief went to paradise. He went to the third heaven. He went to where the tree of life is. He went to the presence of God. Someone else, though, might counter that and say, well, Jesus had to go in heaven alone as the high priest, and so no one, and so no one else could go in until he went in and came back out, and so he would not be able to go in. So he went to the good part of Hades until Jesus' return, at which point then he could go into heaven. So there's a couple of different theories about that park, and where I stand on it is I do not know where the thief went when he died. I just do not know. And I used to believe that he went straight to heaven. Then I believed that he went to Hades. Then I believed that he went to heaven again. And at this point, I'm undecided. So how would a full preterist respond? I just gave you about 3 possible responses there. Okay, I said I was only going to do 10 minutes. I'm not feeling all too well. So let me go ahead.